So you're here because you don't just want the headlines of history. You want to know how we actually know what happened.
Exactly. It's about peeling back the layers.
So today we're doing a deep dive into how historians figure things out. It's definitely more complicated than just hitting the library.
Oh, much more. Someone once described it like trying to piece together a shattered stained glass window. Some bits are clear, some are gone, some are faded.
That's a great analogy. So our mission today is to look at all the different tools historians use, from, dusty old documents to really cutting-edge tech.
That's the plan, to unpack that whole diverse toolkit.
Okay, so where do they even start? Like, what's the absolute basic foundation?
Well, one of the real cornerstones is primary source criticism. That means really digging into original documents, analyzing them carefully.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Think about the Panama Papers leak a few years back. Historians and journalists using historical methods basically acted like forensic accountants. They were tracing shell company ownership, digging through things like notarized deeds, email chains, trying to connect the dots.
Ah, so it's like detective work, finding hidden connections within the documents.
Precisely. Uncovering hidden networks, in that case of global finance.
Cool. But it's not all documents, is it? What about actual stuff?
Absolutely. Material culture,
Yeah.
the physical objects people left behind, that's huge, especially when you combine it with scientific analysis.
How so?
We'll take that recent study, I think it was 2023, on Viking age graves in England. They used ancient DNA analysis.
Right, I heard about this.
And they found that some skeletons buried with weapons, who everyone just assumed were male warriors,
Yeah.
were actually female,
Mm-hmm.
which really shakes up our assumptions about gender roles back then, who held power.
Wow. So the science directly challenged the old interpretation of the artifacts. It makes you wonder what else we're getting wrong by just assuming.
Doesn't it? It shows how easily we project our own biases onto the past.
Okay, so we've got documents, we've got artifacts plus science, but history often deals with huge populations, big trends. How do they handle that scale?
That's where quantitative methods come in, sometimes called cliometrics. It's about using large data sets, statistical analysis.
Cliometrics, okay.
Yeah, so for instance, there's a massive database called IPUMS. Researchers use it to crunch U.S. Census data alongside other info, like, say, where railroads were built.
And what does that tell them?
Well, it's provided really solid evidence showing how railroad expansion directly impacted wage growth in different parts of the U.S. in the late 1800s. It helps map out those big economic forces.
So using big data to see the big picture makes sense. And I guess computers are playing a bigger role now, too. Digital humanities.
Oh, definitely. Text mining, for example. Using computers to find patterns in enormous amounts of text that a human just couldn't possibly read through.
Like what kind of patterns?
There was a fascinating pilot project at the Library of Congress. They fed computers something like 20 million digitized newspaper pages.
20 million? How did they even digitize that?
Through OCR, optical character recognition, basically scanning them and turning the images into searchable text. Anyway, they trained the computers to look for linguistic spikes.
Linguistic spikes?
Yeah, like a sudden jump in how often certain words or phrases were being used. In this case, they were looking for language shifts before waves of anti-Chinese legislation in the U.S.
Whoa! So the computer could spot rising prejudice in the language itself.
That was the idea, identifying patterns invisible to the naked eye, essentially. A kind of linguistic early warning system in retrospect.
That's incredible power. What about finding things that aren't written down at all? Stuff that's literally buried.
Right, that's where remote sensing comes in. Technologies like LiDAR are game changers.
LiDAR, that's the laser scanning thing, often from planes or drones.
Exactly. So back in 2023, archaeologists in Brazil used it over the Amazon rainforest in Acre State. They found over 10,000 previously unknown pre-Columbian earthworks hidden under the canopy.
10,000, wow!
And what's really compelling is that these findings seem to match up with the oral traditions of local indigenous communities. It suggests that pre-colonial Amazon was much more complex, more densely populated than we used to think.
So the tech is literally uncovering lost landscapes and confirming local knowledge. Amazing.
It really is. Finding completely new pieces of that shattered window.
It feels like history plays by slightly different rules than, say, physics or chemistry. What makes its approach unique?
That's a really key point. A fundamental difference is irreproducibility and contingency.
Meaning you can't rerun the past in a lab.
Exactly. We can't replay the Cuban Missile Crisis with slightly different variables to see what happens. History doesn't work like that. It happened one way, influenced by countless specific factors.
So how do historians deal with that uncertainty?
They piece together the most likely story based on the available evidence. For the Cuban Missile Crisis, that means looking at declassified Soviet documents, White House tapes, diaries from people involved, all sorts of sources.
To build what? A best guess.
You could call it a probabilistic narrative, the most plausible account, given the evidence we have. It acknowledges the uncertainties.
Okay, so it's about constructing a narrative, a story.
Yes, narrative explanation is absolutely central, even when focusing on tiny details, like a single person's life.
Like microhistory.
Right. Think of Carlo Ginzburg's book, The Cheese and the Worms. It's this incredibly detailed reconstruction of the world through the eyes of a 16th century Italian miller.
I've heard that one.
The insight comes from that super detailed, thick description, as anthropologists call it. It opens a window onto a whole belief system.
Zooming right in to understand the bigger picture, what about exploring things that didn't happen, the what-ifs?
Counterfactuals. Historians do use thought experiments asking what if, not just for fun, but to understand the actual impact of events.
How does that work?
Take the Great Irish Famine. To really get a sense of its devastating impact, historians have created models of what might Ireland's population growth have looked like without the potato blight.
I see. By imagining the alternative, you highlight the significance of what actually occurred.
Precisely. It helps measure the true scale of the event's consequences. It's a different kind of analysis than you'd find in a science lab.
Okay, so many methods. But how do you know if a source is any good? If it's reliable?
That's absolutely critical. Evaluating source reliability is core business for historians. One key factor is provenance.
Provenance, meaning?
Basically, where did the source come from? Who made it? Is it authentic? You have to establish its origins.
Any examples where that went wrong?
Oh, famously the Hitler Diaries scandal in the 80s. Stern magazine paid a fortune for them.
Right, and they were fakes.
Total forgeries by a guy named Konrad Kujow.
Yeah.
It took forensic analysis, checking the ink, the paper, the handwriting to expose it. A huge cautionary tale. Never take a source at face value.
Definitely learned that lesson the hard way. Okay, so provenance is key. What else?
Contemporaneity is important. How close in time was the source created to the event it describes?
So sooner is better?
Generally, yes. Sources created right after an event are less likely to be warped by faulty memory or hindsight. Think of Samuel Pepys's diary.
The Great Fire of London guy.
That's him. He wrote about the fire almost immediately. That first-hand, in-the-moment perspective is incredibly valuable.
That makes sense. Less time for the story to change in his head. But you wouldn't rely on just one diary, right?
Absolutely not. That's where corroboration comes in. You need to find agreement across multiple independent sources, if possible.
Like comparing different witnesses.
Exactly. Or different types of evidence. For example, before World War I, there were Austro-Hungarian reports about diplomatic tensions. Then later, Serbian telegrams from the same period were released.
Oh.
And they matched up. They corroborated the existing accounts, strengthening our understanding of what was happening in those crucial days. It's like building a legal case. You need multiple lines of evidence.
Gotcha. Cross-referencing. But even if sources agree, don't people have their own biases?
Always. Bias analysis is crucial. You have to ask, who created this source? Why? What was their perspective? What might they want to hide or emphasize?
How do you account for that?
One way is to seek out contrasting perspectives. For instance, comparing plantation account books, which reflect the owner's view, with, say, oral histories collected from formerly enslaved people, like those in the WPA interviews in the 1930s.
So you deliberately look for different viewpoints to get a fuller picture, warts and all.
You have to. No source tells the whole story neutrally.
Okay, what about eyewitnesses? That seems like the gold standard, but you mentioned memory issues.
Eyewitness testimony is incredibly valuable. It offers perspectives you can't get elsewhere. But yes, it has limitations. Memory isn't a perfect recording device.
Right.
Think about the Christmas Truce in 1914, during World War I. Soldiers' accounts differed on small details like, did the ceasefire start with carol singing or soldiers shouting across to borrow matches?
Details matter. So how do historians sort that out?
By consulting multiple accounts, different battalion diaries, letters home, and cross-referencing them with other data, like weather reports from the day, you build a composite picture.
So even eyewitnesses need backup.
Definitely. And there's also this phenomenon called flashbulb memory.
What's that?
Where a particularly shocking or emotional event create a very vivid memory, but one that might still contain errors, sometimes errors shared by many people.
Like everyone misremembering the same detail?
It can happen. The 1947 Partition of India Archive, which collected oral histories, shows some of this. By interviewing people on both sides of the new border, historians could sometimes spot these shared, slightly inaccurate, but very vivid recollections.
Fascinating. So, crucial evidence, but handle with care.
That's the mantra. Value it, but always corroborate.
We've touched on tech like LiDAR and DNA. How else is technology changing how historians see the past?
It's opening up amazing new windows. Think about CT scanning. We can look inside Egyptian mummies without unwrapping them, learn about their health, how they died.
Non-destructive archaeology.
Exactly, or ground-penetrating radar. At the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, GPR helped locate the buried foundations of the 1608 church.
The one where Pocahontas might have married John Rolfe?
That's the one. It's physically located a site known from historical records, linking archaeology and documents.
That's powerful. Any other examples?
On a more tragic note, satellite imagery, it provided undeniable date-stamped evidence of the destruction of ancient temples in Palmyra, Syria, by ISIS between 2014 and 2018.
Wow. So tech helps document history, even recent tragic history for things like war crime evidence.
Sadly, yes. It provides a form of remote witnessing.
But even with these amazing tools, you still need the historian, right? The interpretation.
Absolutely. Technology gives us new data, new ways to see, but it doesn't tell us what it means. That still requires human analysis, contextual knowledge, critical thinking. The tools don't replace the historian, they augment them.
Okay. A lot of this relies on archives. Dusty rooms full of paper. What are the risks there?
Archives are incredibly vulnerable. The fire at Brazil's National Museum in 2018 was just devastating.
I remember hearing about that. Terrible.
They lost something like 92% of their collection. 20 million artifacts, including unique records of indigenous languages, just gone. It highlights the fragility of physical collections.
An irreplaceable loss. Are there other problems with traditional archives besides physical risk?
Oh, yes. A major one is whose stories get preserved. Traditional archives often reflect the powerful governments, wealthy families, institutions. The voices of ordinary people, marginalized groups, are often missing or underrepresented.
So, gaps in the record. How do historians deal with that?
By actively seeking out what are sometimes called counter-archives. These might be non-traditional sources, like the oral epics passed down in Quilombola communities in Brazil settlements founded by escaped slaves.
So oral history as an archive.
In a sense, yes. Or even looking at modern digital spaces. Some argue that things like the collected #MeToo testimonies shared online function as a kind of contemporary counter-archive, documenting experiences often absent from official records.
That's a really interesting idea, using unconventional sources to fill the gaps. What about digital stuff itself? Is that safe?
Not necessarily. We're facing huge challenges with digital preservation. Ever heard of digital rot?
Can't say I have.
It's where digital files become unreadable because the software or hardware needed to access them disappears, or the storage media itself degrades.
Like old floppy disks.
Exactly. The UK National Archives recently had a big project just trying to rescue data off early 1990s floppy disks because the technology to read them was vanishing and the disks themselves were failing. Preserving digital information long-term is a massive headache.
Huh. You think digital is permanent, but maybe not. So the image of the lone historian in the dusty archive, is that accurate anymore?
Less and less so. While solitary work still happens, collaboration is increasingly important, even essential for some projects.
Like what?
Take the Transatlantic Slave Voyages database. It's this enormous online resource cataloging over 36,000 slave voyages.
Wow, 36,000.
Yeah, that wasn't one person's work. It involved historians, data scientists, archivists in multiple countries, especially West Africa. A huge collaborative effort.
That makes sense for big data projects. Any other kinds of collaboration?
Crowdsourcing is another trend. There was a campaign called #EveryNameCounts.
What was that?
It mobilized something like 50,000 volunteers online to help index records from Nazi concentration camps held in the Erlson archives, using collective effort to make historical data accessible.
50,000 volunteers. That's amazing. People power for history.
Exactly. And we're also seeing more multidisciplinary work, like the African Futures Project, which has climatologists and historians working together to understand how past droughts affected societies in Africa.
So breaking down the barriers between disciplines.
Right. Recognizing that complex historical questions often need expertise from different fields.
It really sounds like the field is evolving. How have the basic methods changed over, say, the last century?
Oh, there have been major shifts. In the mid-20th century, you had the Annales school in France, who started looking beyond just politics and kings.
What did they focus on?
Broad social and economic trends, climate, geography, what they call the longue durée, the long term. Thinking about history over centuries, not just years.
Okay, broadening the scope. What else?
Later, there was the linguistic turn,
Yeah.
a greater focus on how language shapes our understanding of the past, how historical accounts are constructed like narratives.
So looking at history as a text, almost.
In some ways, yes. And more recently, the digital humanities turn we've talked about, using computational tools, sharing code, even using things like Git for version control and research, changing how peer review works sometimes.
Wow, Git for history. That's wild. Any other big shifts happening now?
A really important one is the effort to decolonize archives and historical practice.
What does that mean in practice?
It means challenging the colonial perspectives embedded in many traditional archives and narratives. For example, the Museum of British Colonialism is working with communities in Kenya.
How?
They're doing things like creating 3D scans of former Mau detention camps. But crucially, they're working with Kenyans to embed indigenous knowledge and local perspectives, indigenous metadata, into how that history is presented, giving control back, in a way.
That feels really significant, changing who gets to tell the story.
It is. And then there's the whole explosion of public history, especially online. You've got historians on TikTok.
History TikTok, is that a thing?
It is, reaching huge audiences in new ways. And it's becoming mainstream enough that the American Historical Association is actually developing guidelines for how scholars should cite vertical video, like TikToks, in their research. Expected by 2025, I think.
Citing TikToks in academic history, times are definitely changing.
They really are.
So summing up, it feels like being a historian today is this incredible blend, part detective, part scientist, part data analyst, part storyteller.
That's a great way to put it. You're drawing on this constantly expanding toolkit. Forensic chemistry, satellite imaging, crowdsourced transcription, digital analysis, but still grounded in that fundamental skill of crafting a compelling, evidence-based narrative from the fragments we have, and doing it more collaboratively and with more awareness of different perspectives.
And understanding all these methods, it really gives you, the listener, a much richer appreciation for how we actually know about the past. It's not just received wisdom.
Not at all. It's the product of ongoing, rigorous, and often incredibly creative investigation.
So a final thought then. As all this technology keeps evolving AI, maybe quantum computing down the line, who knows, how do you think that will reshape how we access and interpret that shattered stained glass window?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
What new ways to see will emerge, but also what new problems? Issues of bias baked into algorithms, the digital divide determining who gets access, the challenge of preserving purely digital sources long-term. It's going to keep historians very busy, that's for sure.